Welcome to episode 3 of Hopefully Interesting. Today, Mark and I are going to sort of mostly Mark, I think, break down the idea of measure. What is it? How do you find out what it is? And why is it so important to have an idea of what measure is when you're sword fighting? So, I guess the easiest way to start, or the most way to start that makes the most sense, would be to just what is it? What does it tell us? What does it mean when we say mind your measure when we're sword fighting? And in the simplest terms, how close are you to your opponent, right? I mean,
Right,
that's essentially the Idiot's Guide to Sword Fighting definition of it, right?
right. Yeah, definitely. So, it's something you'll hear a coach in someone's corner say, or an instructor while you're training say, is mind your measure. And what that essentially means is you're too close. And in some traditions of fighting, whether it's sword fighting, boxing, just whatever, um, that is a kind of a foreign concept. You want to get close so you can do the thing you're trying to accomplish. But in most fighting, there's a place at which you are too close to your opponent, um, and it's essentially that in sword fighting terms, it is the range at which they can hit you before without you being able to initiate a return action, or a defensive action. So if we're too close to each other, then it just becomes down to who engages first. And if your reaction time isn't fast enough to pick up on it, i.e., they're too close to you, then it becomes just a shooting match, like a Western movie where they both draw their pistols and whoever gets it out of the holster first ends up winning in concept.
Okay.
So,
Um, so it's pretty much it, right? To explain it as simply as we can, it's how close can you be to your opponent without getting hit, essentially.
kind of, yeah. I
Um,
mean, you're almost always going to get hit unless you just have a significant range advantage, which we'll talk about later.
okay.
But or you're always in range to get hit. You might not get hit, but if you are attacking your opponent, unless you have a significant range advantage, then you're probably going to be in range to get hit if you are in range to hit your opponent.
Okay. And then with a group like what you and I play in, or with a group like what you and I participate in with the Saber Legion, um,
Right.
a lot of people like to talk about the idea of range and measure, and they talk about people's wingspans, which is definitely one way to do it. But I think wingspans come into effect a little more with traditional fighting. I would say boxing and now MMA,
Right.
but I don't even know if wingspans as important as it used to be in MMA because I've seen a fair amount of guys taken down with kicks, and
Yeah.
so that's something extra that you have to watch out for. Ideally, in the game we play, sabers, as we said in a previous video, the LED sabers, or as I believe we were corrected by Daniel Lane, told to use the politically correct term of glowbats. Um,
That's
uh, they in the sport we participate in is 51 inches is
yeah.
the total thing. So, as something that you like to say a lot, which is both fighters using a 51-inch saber or glowbat, um, hands are just as close to you as they are to me.
Correct.
So
And
wingspan.
for a little bit of explanation on that, the in TSL, the back of the hand, so the essentially from the knuckles upward, is a legal target for striking. Other groups do allow strikes to the hilt itself, so the metal portion of the glowbat. Um, Other groups allow finger shots and things like that, but for sake of reference for TSL, it's we're talking about the knuckles upward. Um, Good.
Yeah, because for Hema, I'm not sure. I think hands might be on target for Hema, but I'm not 100% sure, so I don't want to
Right.
say it.
And
But
that really just depends on where you are, what who's running the tournament, who's running the school you're at, because with HEMA, it's not a codified system that you'll find across the board. You'll definitely find some consistencies, but it's not like like Olympic fencing where everyone follows the Olympic rule set. HEMA specifically tries to avoid that so people can't game the system as effectively.
that's fair. And it's one way of handling it, right? Trying to discourage the formation, I guess, of a metagame and a like metagame strategy. Um, there's also the SCA, which both you and I participate in. You've been doing it a little bit longer than I have. I'm not sure about hands being on target or not in the SCA quite so much. I believe they are, but
Right.
also like you and I, our flavor of the SCA currently is rapier fighting. And with complex hilts, that kind of takes a fair amount of the hand off target if you know how to use it, or if you have a hilt more complicated than like me with my cup hilt rapier, where I have a nice part to cover, the top part of my hand, and then the rest of my hand from like here down is, well, I hope you don't hurt me.
Right.
So,
And so, yeah, and it's a weird thing. So this is the rapier I've been using. It's a Darkwood Armory hilt. They're one of their Poppenheimer hilts. And so looking from the back end, because it's a lot easier with the camera, you can see that while from the sides I have great protection, down the center of the in between the two clamshells, it's not as protected. And you can take a fair amount of hits there. It isn't as common. One of the issues that you'll get with complex hilts is, sure, you got the thrust, but now your rapier's stuck. And unfortunately, these Poppenheimers tend to pull off the blunts on the end of the rapier. So that becomes an issue as well. But yeah, with certain swept hilts, it's still an issue. But yeah, if you can take someone's hand in a rapier fight, then it's completely valid. Now, they do have a bit different of a system because they do what some groups refer to as Black Knight style, where if you get stabbed in the hand, we'll talk about stabs. But if you get stabbed in the hand, you can still use that hand to parry, but you can't use it with a weapon. If you get stabbed in the wrist up, from my understanding, to the inseam or the seam of the shoulder, then you can't use that arm. So yes, I can take your arm, but then if you counter with a thrust to the chest, then things get a little more complicated. With the light or the Globat group that we're a part of, it's by first contact because they're plasma blades. So it's by first contact, and that means that if I hit you in the hand, all in a valid spot on the hand, then all actions stop after that. It is hard to do. It's hard to effectively, reliably hit someone in the hand because you have to do almost a full body action most of the time, whereas your opponent just has to move their hand out of the way. But yeah, so it's the general concept of measure is always going to be to the closest target or to your desired target. So measuring kendo might be to the men, to the forehead, or it might be a stab to the throat, which I believe is valid.
I believe so.
Yeah. So, and in MMA and boxing, it's, if you punch someone in the arm, in the forearm while they're blocking, it's not going to do a whole lot. But if you now your measure might be to their stomach, right? You maybe want to land a juicy hit to their stomach, or if they're down guarding their stomach and their rib cage, you might want to gauge measure based off your opponent's head. So it is just as valid in MMA or boxing as it is in any kind of sword fighting or sword-like object fighting.
Right. So I guess we could distill measure down even more, and we just distill it down to essentially reach. Right. Measure is your reach. If we want to be as simplistic as possible,
Right.
I
Reach the target. Yeah.
Yeah. I think measure tries to encompass a little more within the realm of fighting. Reach is just kind of distance, and I think measure affects some of the more complicated ideas potentially
Right.
that happen while trying to fight and maintain your distance while your opponent's trying to do the same and keep themselves safe.
Yeah, and
Uh,
like getting back to what you were saying before, in the Globat group, it's advantageous for a shorter fighter to attack a taller fighter's back of the hand because it is the closest target, and being that the limit to the sabers is 51, it means that if I grab on the very bottom, the pommel of the saber, it doesn't matter how tall you are or how short you are, we are equal distance away to our closest valid targets.
yeah. So, and you were talking about, again, with the Saber Legion, the group that we're part of, attacking the hand. Sorry, popped a little there. Attacking the hand isn't always the best option, because maybe you have to move your body while doing that strike, and all they have to do is moving their hand. And you turned me onto this idea of a system of thought, or in older, trying to dress it up too much, an idea of
Yeah.
more accurately talking about measure, or talking about measure in maybe more more complicated potentially terms, by talking about something called true time, which it talks
Right.
about time of hand, time of body, time of foot, and how quickly do all of those parts of a person's body move while trying to
Right.
hit somebody with a sword. And you sent me a really great video on it and kind of turned me on to that. I want to call it an
Yeah.
ideology, but I feel like I'm talking about religion when I'm saying that word.
Well,
That
it's
thought process, I guess.
right, and the idea. So it comes from George Silver's paradoxes of defense, being that time of hand, time of body, time of foot, time of feet. The idea is that your hand moves first, then your body, then your foot, and then your second foot. So if you're in time of hand, you're in distance to simply strike with just the movement of your hand or arm, really, realistically. Whereas if we're, say, if I'm beyond, about using the Saber Legion as an example, my reach to my shoulder, the pocket of my shoulder to the tip of my blade is about 6.5 feet with the way I fight. So if I'm beyond 6.5 feet, then I have to engage the body. I have to lean to gain further distance. And if I'm beyond the distance at which my body can lean and I'm still stable, then I have to engage a foot. And if we're even further away than that, then I have to engage a second foot. With the second foot being the longest amount of time, and also the longest distance, because that's something that a lot of systems don't say specifically, but they hit on, is that the further away you are, the more time it takes to hit someone. And also, I mean, so this idea comes from George Silver's paradox of defense. It's not specifically how I fight, but he had a good way of explaining it.
Yeah. And there's even a series of videos that I've watched by a, I believe he's a still active fighter in the SCA, and I'm going to butcher his name because it's fancy. Monteo, Montero, I believe, or the other way around. Um, but he has a very few, maybe a handful of videos up on
Right.
YouTube, and he has some good notes on measure. Mostly lead with your hand, and then he talks about in that same example you were giving. I'm a shorter fighter fighting you, a taller fighter. How do I how do I take your range away? How do I decrease your measure while increasing my measure? And a lot of the points he seems to get is make them take longer, make them take more time.
Right.
You take the most efficient path and make them have to go around your sword.
Right. And so just, assigning some terms to things, right? So when we're talking about measure, you have the length, which is the distance between essentially the tip of your sword or whatever part of the sword you want to impact with, and the target. So, like I said, if my reach with the glow bat is 6.5 feet, then I have to, um, and I'm 7 feet away, then I'm half a foot length away from my target, my intended target. So I have to somehow make up that reach or make up that distance. Gauging that is a part of what we call measure. In addition to that, you have your level, which is okay. If my shoulder, like again, if you're shorter, right? Um, if you're shorter and you're striking against an opponent, you're going to have to raise your hand up or down depending on the height of the target, right? So with that, if you come off of this initial shoulder line, where it's horizontal out from the shoulder, anything else you do is going to shorten your reach. So that's something you have to account for when making your attack, because we can't change. We can raise and lower the shoulder height slightly. We can lower it more than we can raise it, unless you want to fight on your tippy toes, right? But generally speaking, you won't drop as much to bring your shoulder online to gain the most amount of reach. There are some Italian systems that talked about doing such a thing. There are definitely some other systems out there that I'm just not familiar with, but the Italian systems are probably the most prevalent. Um, and then you have your line, which is being what is generally called offline or online. And if you think about it in terms of a fencing platform, an Olympic fencing platform, which is one straight line, if you're still on that line, even if you're not completely squared up to your opponent, then you're still on line. If you leave that line, you become offline. Now, that also gets a little two common misconceptions. One is that um, in order to be offline, you need to be completely off of that square or that rectangle, your pathway to fight the other person. That if you're completely squared up to your opponent, you're online, and if you have to be way over to one side to be on or offline. Well, you don't really, because you're still online. And generally, what I teach is to line up. If you want to go offline to either side, you line up. If I'm moving to my right, I would line up my left shoulder with my opponent's left shoulder. If I'm moving to the left, I line up my right shoulder with my opponent's right shoulder. And what that means is I'm still in range. I'm not decreasing my range, but I'm making it a little more difficult for my opponent to hit me. And maybe I'm trying to gain a mechanical or just distance advantage.
I'm glad you touched on that because I know there's a couple times. I think both you and I in discussion groups or comment threads have mentioned, get offline or close the line or something similar to talking about lines in sword fighting. And potentially because I think a lot of people that fence in the Saber Legion, I'm going to call it that, sword fight fence.
Yeah. Sword fighting, fencing is sword fighting.
Yeah. But a lot of people that do that, I think a lot of people are interested in sword fighting, and this is their gateway drug, so to speak. It's a way where they can, yeah, and it's a way that people are getting into it. I don't think everybody wants to go and read manuals and look at historical text and deep dive stuff on YouTube. I would say I
it's
think
a special breed.
Yeah, I would say you definitely are the extreme. I'm getting my toes wet walking into the waters of HEMA and the SCA because sword and sword shaped objects are something that have always interested me. Going back to being, I don't know, 10 or 11 in my grandparents' backyard and my sister and I having wiffle bats and sword fighting with them and getting in trouble all summer long.
I think that's how most people start down the path of sword fighting, is hitting each other with baseball bats or, the toy swords or lightsabers or whatever you get from Walmart or wherever you shop.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of people are kind of interested in Star Wars, and that's what's getting them into this and hopefully opening their eyes to this idea of sword fighting. But I think that's why sometimes when we drop maybe some terms that would be considered inside baseball terms, right? Offline, online, mind the line, close the line, mind your measure. It's why some people look at us confused, like English.
Right. It is almost like speaking a different language when you dive deep enough down to the jargon. And just wait until we start practicing enough and I'm yelling Old English at you during a fight.
Or you talk to one of the guys that, you started training down here, and now I'm trying to help, but you've got him working on Italian longsword, and either
specifically Ray, yeah.
And either you've told me you've checked in on him or he's checked in with you and he's learning the Italian terminology for stuff.
Right.
He's going above and beyond and impressed me.
Right. And that's something I've never really bothered to do. I've been studying Fiore for a while now, and I focus on the English versions of their guards and terms just because they're easier to remember. It's a lot easier to say woman's guard than pasta di donna, right? And I'm going to butcher that, obviously. My Italian is non-existent, so but it's easier, and it's easier to instruct someone else based on their native language rather than the original language that it might have been produced in. But there are certain terms that don't have clear translations. So if you take the the English longsword sources, they talk about rakes and hawks and things like that, and it's hard to figure out what exactly they mean. Some of the terms are relatively close to what we use. Other terms are explained in later manuals, like in this instance, George Silver or Swetnam or Wild. But a lot of them, it's just like, I have no idea what that means. Yeah, so, not everyone wants to deep dive into the manuals, but everyone starts somewhere, right? So if you go join I'll equate it to like dance, right? You might not study the waltz, you might not study the tango, but whoever your instructor is probably did. and now they're teaching you based off what they learned over their years of dance. So you're indirectly getting it. So if you start if you start with a group like the Saber Legion, you are going to go learn from somebody who probably either learned from someone who read a manual or sat down and read a manual themselves. Yeah, I mean, they're definitely interesting, but they're a lot to get through. But the other topic I wanted to hit on with lines, though, is the idea of circling your opponent. You'll see it a lot in more traditional martial arts, but you see it a lot in certain sword fighting martial arts, or even when people are explaining techniques in HEMA. Sometimes HEMA's not as big of a culprit because I feel like enough people spar in HEMA that they understand it. But you see it a lot in movies, and this is the idea that if we're squared up, I can maybe beat your saber to one side and then take 3 or 4 steps around you, and then clobber you, right? And this was actually, I got into a debate which on my end was relatively civil, and on the other person's end it did not end up being relatively civil. For SCA heavies, the idea that in single combat, the idea was that I was in an extended foot positioning, like you'll see in Fiore, with your back leg kicked way out behind you, kind of thing, and you're down and leaning into your shield. Because in this case, I was talking about shields, and I had the shield way out in front of me, so I was in a very elongated stance. And her opinion was that, well, if someone got to my side, they could knock me over. And it's like, that's great. If I ever am in a shield wall or a group fight, I will never do this. You are correct. But you're never going to get around to my side. And the idea, like I said, it mostly, in my opinion, springs from movies, but you see it a lot in when people are explaining techniques. Is this idea of, just go around to their right or left side. And it's like, that's not at all how this works, because if I'm circling you and you don't counter circle me, then I'm taking 3 or 4 steps. I'm covering 10 to 20 feet, depending on the size of the circle, maybe even more. And all you have to do is swing your back foot. Now you're online again. Now, also, it happens a lot in video games, right? So my opinion is that the people trying to tell other people to do this just don't spar that much. Because I've never faced an opponent who let me break more than like a 15, 30 degree angle before they then turn to match it. Because they're not that stupid.
Right. Or even, I mean, to give us a smaller target, which ideally should be easier to get around, I've fought people with Subas, and I've taken a step offline to give me an angle where I thought I could break and get around the Suba. And people that are used to fighting with Subas, that Suba sometimes feels like it may as well be a foot around.
Oh, yeah.
Because they know how to catch and deflect, and it is infuriating. And if they can make, in the Saber Legion, it's about 3-inch big disc, right? A 3-inch big disc. They can make that feel like it's a foot around.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's essentially, it's a 3.5, but it's, what it is it's this chunk of metal here. Now, this is abnormally thick. This is about the thickness of 2. But it's 3.5 inches. And the idea, and you can demonstrate it real well with a camera, so I'm going to take advantage of that, is that the closer this is to the camera, the more of my body that it blocks off, right? Um, and so it's a trick with, I think it's called foreshortening on cameras, or foreground versus a background. But it's you see the same thing in manuals like I-33, and other like Bolognese traditions for buckler fighting. Is this idea of, I'm going to take my buckler and stick it towards you, and it creates a larger cone of effect onto the target that you can't strike at. With TSL, it's more about um, being able to manipulate it correctly and catch other sabers. Um, so, and that's a little harder to do. But yeah, for instance, if I have a 16-inch hilt, which is the maximum, and I have my Suba at the emitter end, and my hand is down at the pommel end, then this Suba being up here would essentially create a bigger cone of effect for my hand, so it's harder to reach my hand. So in essence, yeah, it is probably about a foot around, or the cone of effect can be. So yeah, no, it can be infuriating to try and do stuff like that. But the idea of expecting your opponent to not move while you're doing something is just ludicrous to me. And so it kind of infuriates me when I hear people talking about that kind of thing.
Right. I think some of it, like you said, stems from a lack of experience,
Mhm.
or just lack of doing it. Um,
Right.
so,
Yeah.
uh,
And then the last bit of it is you have to consider is quality of attack, right? We even have to consider it with the Globats, even though technically any hit counts. But I would say that it's most prevalent within the longsword community, where if if I have my blade here, which apparently I can't get all of it on camera, but the idea being that the only valid strikes are about in the top third of the blade. Um, and so you have to gauge, okay, I have to hit with the top third of my blade, or uh, the, the, the third section of my blade. So if I have 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4, so the third fourth of my blade, that I have to either strike with that portion or run through with the tip, right? Um, and so that's definitely something to keep in mind. And in terms of the Glowback groups, it has the same effect, but for a different reason, being that if you strike with just the tip, if you don't strike deep enough onto the target or at the correct angle, the judge might not see it and might not call it as a valid point. So, um, yeah, so that's basically the four ideas to consider as far as the judgment portion of measure goes.
so how does somebody practice this or put it into effect aside from just sparring more? How does somebody figure out what their measure is or their effective range is? Is it just sparring more? What I mean by
Um,
doing?
so that's going to be a big chunk of it, right? But I mean, you can use a Pell or a punching bag or whatever you've got laying around, and practice that way of being at a specific distance and allowing yourself to gauge the distance to the target, right? Um, so if I know, okay, I'm at 10 feet, I can do some quick math, being that again, back to the Globats, my reach is 6.5 feet. I'm at my front foot is 10 foot away from the Pell. So that means I have to cover another 3.5 feet, which means that I'm going to have to take a passing step in order to do it. Because let's say I cover 2 foot with lunge. Well, I know that in order to cover 3.5 feet, I have to do a passing step or a gathering step, as some systems prescribe. So, so you can very easily use a Pell. You can very easily use a punching bag, or even just a specific, like you can put a line of tape, and when your tip has crossed that line of tape, then you tell that that is the distance covered, right? A Pell or a punching bag with little targets on it would probably be your best bet, because that allows you to affect the level and line as well. Because that is definitely something to think about. Because if I move offline, let's say I'm going to my left, if I move offline, now I need to consider how close I'm actually getting to my target. Because I've seen plenty of fighters who they get offline, which is great, but now they can't hit anything because they moved too far offline and now they're out of range, or out of measure. So yeah, I mean, you can very easily do that. But a large chunk of it is going to come down to sparring, because you need to one of the biggest things to learn is how fast you can get away with some movements. And in terms of that, we brought it up briefly, but George Silver's True Times, being a time of hand, body, foot, feet. And that's something to consider, is that yes, you need to cover that distance, and that's great, but you need to also know how quickly to cover that, or how quickly is the most effective way to cover that distance. Being that if you move your hand first, that's great. That bought me an extra 3 feet. Now I'm moving now I'm going to move my body, which buys me an extra foot. And then I gather with my back foot and I step with my front foot. And that bought me that entire 10 foot of distance that we talked about earlier. So it's something to keep in mind while you're doing this, is how efficiently can I move that distance, right? Because the hand is always going to be faster than the foot. The body is always going to be faster than the foot. Moving 1 foot is always going to be faster than moving 2 feet. So I might want to cheat it a little bit, and through strategic movement around the ring, I might want to try and close that measure so I can strike in time of body or time of
I
hand.
think it also depends on the weapon and the system you're working for or from.
Right.
Because I know you've talked to me about it, and in other SCA or HEMA boards, I hear lots of people reference it, but 10 feet is no problem if you are a believer of the 12-foot lunge.
Right. Joseph Swetnam's 12-foot lunge. Yeah. Which, I mean, to be fair, that's you're actually covering 9 or so feet when you do that, which is still a terribly far lunge. But yeah, so I mean, 10 foot isn't a problem if you can lunge 12 feet, but that still puts you in time of foot.
Yeah.
So if your opponent slips, so we talked about length or we talked about line and using line to screw up your opponent's measure. But you can also do it in length, which is you slip generally backwards. You'll see this mostly if I were to go in and strike at my opponent's leg, they slip the leg and hit me in the head, because they have increased the distance it takes to hit them in the leg, but not. And then
by you reaching, you bring your head down. Yeah.
Right. I've decreased the distance at which they need to hit me in the head. So if you commit to a 12-foot lunge in time of foot, I can slip a foot, or I can slip slightly or off to the side. And if all I do is lean, right, then that and avoid your thrust coming in. Let's say it's at the chest, which is what Joseph Swetnam prescribes for that lunge. If all I do is lean, I am now in time of body, which means I can lean and stab you. And that puts me at a much quicker tempo. Now, there's obviously it's more complicated than just leaning to one side and stabbing your opponent, but it isn't always more complicated. It's really subjective to how you train, what system you're studying, and your own personal ability for movement, how tall you are, how long your sword is, how quickly you can move your legs. But as a standing principle, the hand always moves faster than the foot. Now, in terms of like MMA, or kickboxing or things like that, the foot might move slower than the hand, which it still does because that's how body mechanics work. But it's going to impact with a lot more force. So that's something to consider as well, too, with sword fighting, is that if I have my rapier and let's just say you're wearing real thick clothing, because it doesn't take much force to pierce skin. It doesn't take, with a thrust, it doesn't take much force to pierce skin with a shirt over it. But we know that if you're wearing 3 or 4 coats or something like that, then sure, yeah, it's going to take more force. So in terms of, we'll keep it simple with the thrust. In terms of thrusting, if I just extend my arm and stab my opponent, that's not going to stab with nearly as much force as if I then lean into it. And that's not going to hit with nearly as much force as if I take a step with that or lunge. And theoretically the same with the second foot as well, because now I'm hitting with the entire inertia of my body behind it. So there are mechanical advantages to using time of foot. However, I would say that if your opponent can hit you with time of hand and you're focusing on time of foot, then your opponent's probably going to win because they can hit you and then clear measure in one way or another before you can hit them.
That's fair.
So, but yeah, I mean, it essentially all equates down to what the time needed to strike your opponent. And that's something that is talked about, but I don't feel like it's clearly understood. So I have my small lightsaber blade or polycarbonate tube, and I move it. It looks like it's moving really fast, right? Because the idea is that, or what we're seeing is that it's covering a smaller circle. So if you have two circles, one's 100 miles across, or 100 miles across, and then one's 1,000 miles across, and you have 2 cars driving around those circles, both going at 100 miles per hour, it's going to seem like the one driving in the smaller circle is faster, but it's really not. So if I swing this, I can effectively swing this at the same speed as I can swing the full-size one, right? But the difference is, while the tip is moving at essentially the same FPS, the smaller blade is going to cover that circle a lot quicker. So I see a lot of people talking about how, I can move my smaller saber or sword or whatever the case might be, faster than someone can swing their bigger one. So I'm going to get the point first because I'm faster. That's only half the story. Because if you take the car example, for instance, they're both moving at the same speed, right? So you can make an argument of if I train with it, I get faster, but that goes both ways. And so you have to, whenever you step into the ring, you have to give your opponent the assumption of credibility that they train just as much as you. Because if you don't do that, then you're probably going to end up walking into some spear points or sword points.
Right. And I think the person that says they're faster with a shorter sword, are they mindful of measure? Is that something they consider, they actively think about? They might be able to swing their shorter saber quicker than I can swing my bigger saber. And that's great if I'm swinging a saber. What if I'm
Right.
stabbing? What if I'm taking the most efficient route to them, which is a straight line, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of things that come into it, and a lot of what encompasses it is essentially knowing your effective range and your opponent's effective range, and measures just kind of a broad term that covers that, and I think almost everything else we've managed to talk about, and maybe some of the things we've gotten off topic and talked about.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it all comes down to measure. And I feel like a lot of people who make those kind of arguments are basing it on isolated instances or isolated cases of proof. Right.
Yeah, and you also have people who maybe they do sword arts aside from stuff in the Saber Legion or other Globat sparring, and they don't have to worry about a 360 omnidirectional cutting tool that's a plasma sword. Like
Right.
in the SCA, there's flats of blades, and HEMA, there's flats of blades.
Right.
In HEMA, with the saber that I've talked about and I've showed off in at least one of our other videos, I have a flat of the blade and I have a blunt back edge of the blade. So I only have one cutting surface. There's only one way I can hit you with that, or with that weapon. There's only one way you can effectively be hit. So if Mark comes in like a cut like this, it's not like with the Saber Legion where, oh, my sword's like this, I'm just gonna slap you. He has to bring his tip up, and depending on the HEMA tournament you're in, he has to strike with the right third or quarter of the blade. Maybe
Right.
he has to draw as he's cutting, depending on what system and what tournament and where he's fighting and who he's fighting against, and a lot of those things. And TSL kind of, I think you said it best, where TSL is worst case sword fighting. Could it?
Right.
Maybe. So let's say it does, right?
Right. Exactly. I mean, honestly, if you're fighting a guy who has a plasma sword, that is worst case scenario. You know, it doesn't get much worst case for sword fighting. But yeah, so, and that's how I've always preferred to train as well. Even getting into the HEMA side of it, is that what is the worst case scenario if this happens? I've been going to the SCA groups and a HEMA group, that I have taken hits that they waved off. It's like, oh, that's not, it's not, they felt like they didn't hit with significant amount of force, or, whatever the case might be. And I'm not talking about hitting with the flat, I'm talking about hitting with the edge. They didn't get enough of a push, or they didn't hit with enough force. And I take it, I'll take it. Now, in a tournament, I'll leave that up to the judge. But in my own personal training, what is worst case scenario? If I get hit with a sharp pointy object, maybe I just stop fighting right there. Maybe my body goes into shock. Maybe you hit an artery or vein, or maybe if I'm swinging a sword and you get a light tippy cut, a light tip cut across the inside of my wrist, maybe you cut all the tendons and I drop my sword or cross the back, you know. Um, what is the worst case scenario? And so when I'm sparring with people, I tend to take any valid hit. Like, it obviously it has to be with the edge to a valid historical target, but I just take it. And I'll signal, yes, I got hit. And I don't even bother to try for the afterblow. Now, on the other side of it, is that giving my opponent false readings for how they're doing? Maybe. But I also feel like in one of those groups, I don't take on an instructor role. So I'm there for my own personal training. And if they ask me to stop that, then I'll stop it.
Right.
But I haven't been asked to stop yet.
But even like you said, they seem to acknowledge the fact that maybe it wasn't a I've heard this term in HEMA quite a bit. It wasn't a quality cut, right? So maybe they're aware of that, but you're accepting the hit because in your mind that's what's going to make you a better fighter potentially.
Right.
And they're at least somewhat aware that ooh, maybe I need to make an adjustment in the game. So
Right. And I've heard it a lot. We're going on a little bit of a tangent, but I've heard it a lot that HEMA practitioners or SCA guys, they gals or whatever, SCA the rapier practitioners, they say that, oh, you're coming over from an omnidirectional cutting device. Make sure you're hitting with the tip or what have you. But really, if you're doing a solid technique, and yes, I might not hit with it at perfectly 90 degrees to the target, right? But if I'm doing a martially valid technique or historical technique and I come in at a slight angle, that's still going to mess up your day, right? And I've never hit with the flat of the blade that I did not recognize. Oh, I messed up because I deflected off their rapier and into them, and so I came in at a bad angle, or oh, he moved to the side as I was cutting, and I just tried to course correct on the way there, and I didn't turn my hand enough in order to get the blade online. A lot of people discredit groups like TSL as, oh, it's not martially valid, or it's not a historical technique, and it's like, well, that's a load of crap. I can justify just like 90%, 99% of the hits that happen in TSL. Give me a Google search engine and enough time, and I can justify it, right? But yeah, I've never really had that issue. Like, oh, you came in like full blown with the flat of the blade this way, and it's like, well, it's obviously not how a sword works, and
right.
turn that way.
Right.
Yeah. But some, like I was saying earlier, some groups are, oh, well, you have to hit with the third portion of the blade, or you have to do a triple double backflip and stab your opponent in the left eye socket. And it's like, okay, guys, we need to calm down.
Yeah. Like you said, I think I have taken the train slightly off the rails. So to get us back on track, is there anything else about measure that we need to hit on? I think we hit most of it, or most of what we had in mind. We talked about measure, kind of what it was, just kind of general overview of how can we define it and why is it something that's important. You covered the idea of true time.
Correct.
And then we kind of deep dove into a little bit, maybe not deep dove, maybe we just kind of hit the surface on how do we apply it? How do you find or realize what your effective range is?
Yeah.
And that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And so with that, I mean, it's really just going to come down to what is your discipline you're fighting in, right? Because there are, and what are the rules for that discipline? And I harp on rules. There's a lot of people who feel like, HEMA is a martial art, and they are correct. And then there are a lot of people who feel like HEMA is a sport, and they are also correct. And it's really just dependent on how you want to view it. I've also heard some people who have voiced their opinion that HEMA should not, like, there shouldn't be a rule set. You just do the technique, and if it's good technique, then it's fine for sparring. And how I choose to view it is, well, we know swords kill people, but how do we decide how dead you are, right? We're not actually fighting with sharp swords, most of us. And so how do we decide when you're dead? Or else you get one, tanky dude who just gets hit 27 times in the chest and doesn't take it. So we have to have rules in order to establish when are you dead, or when is the fight over. And with the Globats, for example, it's any contact, because that's what you see in the movies for the most part. With HEMA, it's, you have to hit with this portion of the blade. And that's great, because that would be the most damaging cut, if you will. I think that the rule sets are important because it conforms to, if we conform to, or we study the techniques in the martial art to learn how to do the techniques properly, and then we use the sport side of it to determine the impact on the target. That's how I view it, at least. But so you might be doing Olympic fencing, and that's great. And so I might talk about, get offline. Well, that doesn't work in Olympic fencing. Or I might talk about thrusting, and maybe in your club, thrusts with a long sword aren't weighted as heavily as cut. That's great. But how do we apply it in practice? It's essentially for length. You have to cover a certain distance, but it's also the idea of, working slips into your game. Maybe you don't, take 4 steps back every time your opponent swings at you, but instead you wait for this, you see the swing coming in, you minor dodge and let the swing past you, and then you return the strike, right? Which is just as valid as blocking, because they still didn't hit you.
Right. Or like Hutton, I think, prescribes in his manual, Cold Steel, after you deliver an attack, you come up in a hanging guard, because that sword was coming this way. It's going to cover a decent line, right, on my body to kind of preemptively put something in the way of a counterattack. And that's his way of, as you're moving out of measure, this is what you do to protect yourself.
Right. And so, the idea is I cut or do thrust or whatever. And then when I'm retreating, I'm in something akin to that. It's hard with the camera so close, but you get the idea. And the idea is that I am blocking off a lane of attack, right? Which, if we get back to line, that can be considered in line as well, or in level. And the idea is that I'm closing off a line, so I have to make you go offline, because anytime you go offline, you are increasing your distance to the target. And so if I'm standing in a guard, or if I present a guard after an attack, essentially what I'm doing is closing off a line to make you go offline, to increase your time to target while decreasing my time to target. Because I can choose when to open up that line again. And it's real prevalent within rapier fencing. You'll start with your blade on line, they thrust, you move it offline, and then return the thrust. because you have increased their distance or time to target, and you have decreased your time to target. So yeah, Hutton did the same thing with hanging guards, or his like 12 or so actual guards that he prescribes. But so yeah, I mean that's definitely a way to do it, to increase your opponent's time. Another thing to keep in mind while you're sparring or practicing at home is just walking towards your opponent. Which sounds like a dumb thing to do, but you gauge where you want to hit, or with what time do you want to hit, what true time. Say that I want to hit in time of body. Maybe I just walk forward. Now with a guard presented, or maybe not. But I walk forward and gauge, okay, now I'm in time of body, and launch the attack. So you can definitely gauge, or you can definitely work that into your fighting, that, well, he's all the way over there. You can also use it the other way of, at the beginning of a match when you're sizing up your opponent, and you're kind of circling each other. Well, I know that if I'm out of time of feet, the time at which it takes to move 2 feet to get to me, then I don't have to even show a guard. It doesn't matter at that point, because we might as well be on opposite sides of the football field. I can now. I'm not going to like have my sword behind me, or in my left hand off to the side. Sometimes I will, but that's because I'm cheeky. But I'm going to be ready to present a guard, but I'm not going to stress being in a guard, so I can conserve energy, right? And so that's one way of doing that. Another thing you can do is, if you're in a system that wants you to strike deeper onto your opponent's body, then if you look at some of the positions of like Fabrice, really crouched down, leaning forward, where it's hiding most of your body behind a sword, or rapier in that case, which is a sword, but so you might hide the valid targets, which forces your opponent to either come offline or change their level of attack, right? And or just choose to not strike with as much quality. Maybe they have to go for your hand now, or have to go for your forearm, because it's the only valid thing they can get to. So, I mean, there's both ways to mess with your opponent's measure, and also to aid your own measure. But if, like, the most important thing is being able to gauge that distance. Because if you can't gauge the distance, then your opponent can just walk up on you and smack you in time of hand. If you, or you throw a cut thinking you're in time of body, and you now miss, right? Which could be very easily turned into a time of foot stab. So I throw a cut, my opponent slips, and I stab them, right? With time of foot. So that's definitely a possibility.
So, yeah. Basically, measure is a simple word that really kind of means a lot of things. It's something you should be mindful of. You should be mindful of your opponents. You should use it in a fight, or develop a sense of measure. And I think we've kind of uh, beaten the horse dead at this point, unless Mark has anything
Uh-huh.
else he'd like to add. I think I've touched upon most of what I think my notion of measure was, or Mark has said it before I've had a chance to.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Um, yeah, I mean that's pretty much sums it up. A thing to keep in mind with measure is to use the longest sword or saber or whatever that your rule set allows for, because then you're never at a measured disadvantage. Um, Even like we were saying earlier, the great equalizer in TSL is the back of the hand being a valid target.
Yeah.
It means that even if I am 4 foot nothing fighting a 7 foot tall fighter, the back of the hand is always going to be the closest target. So it's just something to keep in mind with that. And I'm sure there are detracting opinions from that, but um, it's what I've seen in my research and my own fighting. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think we have successfully beat this dead horse.
Fantastic. Well,
Right.
with that, then I guess we will say this has been our third episode. Thank you for tuning in as always, and hopefully you thought this was interesting.